Welcome back, everybody, and today we're going to do something a little bit different. This is going to be another one of our tech tips, and one thing that people have asked me about a couple of times is, what do I do with this SSD now? And depending on what they're doing, the answer is typically either clone your existing drive to it or to do a clean install. Well, that cloning step is a little bit beyond normal for a few people, and I figured this was a good excuse to do a demo of it. I've got a laptop here, a older Panasonic Toughbook with a mechanical hard drive in it. It's been booting basically since we started recording. You saw me hit the power button and start the stopwatch on my phone, which is now at 45 seconds still. And what we're going to do is I'm going to fire up OBS on our test bench once this is done doing its thing, so I know how long it took to start with. We're over a minute now. And we're going to take an image. So 1 minute, 8 seconds to hear the Windows sound. Still can't see anything on the screen to sign in yet. Anyway, so we're going to take an image of that drive and then redeploy that image to, I've got a 500 gig MX500 SATA SSD here, and then we're going to do this. I'm going to boot it and see how long it takes me to sign in. Because I got to tell you, oh good, it did Windows updates. 2 minutes and 54 seconds. It's not really a great time. So we're going to just hard power it off, start it from cold, and it's on AC power. 53 seconds to make a noise. Please wait, what now? You did Windows Update last time you booted. Alright, so 1 minute 30 seconds to get to a logon screen that's pretty unresponsive once it's there. So I'm just going to power this off. And while I pull the drive out, I'm going to talk about what tools you do and or don't need in order to do this. So this system uses a little drive carrier there. So there are a few different ways to go about imaging a drive. And the way I typically do it involves probably the most complicated process, and that's the one we're going to show here. There are simpler options. The simplest is to do a direct drive-to-drive clone where you can install both drives in a target system at the same time. And that's pretty common on desktops. So if I'm upgrading a desktop from a spinning drive to an SSD and it has an open SATA port, we'll say for example, since you can sort of do this to NVMe, but I don't recommend it. So SATA hard drive to SATA SSD. You can just install both drives, fire up Macrium, and tell it to clone drive A to drive B, and then reboot, change what your boot drive is in the BIOS, and off you go. Laptops is a little more complicated than that. You'll need something like this, although unfortunately not this one because they don't sell this particular model anymore. This is a Icy Dock. What do they call it? The Icy Dock Lite, the MB881U3-1SA. Terrible name. But basically this thing was my all-in-one choice for drive reader because it would take 2.5-inch IDE, 3.5-inch IDE, and 2.5 or 3.5-inch SATA. Now, we're just dealing with 2.5-inch SATA, So you can use some of the cheaper ones. I'll link a few. They're usually like 10 or 20 bucks on the expensive side. And I'll put some more flexible units like this one in. But this one needs power because it supports 3.5-inch drives. I think it might actually work on 2.5s without it, but since I have the adapter, we'll use it. It's really simple. We plug in the drive like that, and then on our test bench, we just open up Macrium. And it shows me the drive. There it is, my MBR disk, ASMT 2105, which is what the IC doc identifies as 300 gigs. Great. So this is where I'm going to call out a couple of things. Number one is that we're going to take an image, we're not going to do a clone. These are two similar but different functions. Basically, an image takes this drive, copies everything on it into a file that I can then deploy to a new drive. And that's fantastic for a variety of reasons. I can set Macrium up to do that repetitively for backup purposes. It's actually a pretty popular one for me for desktops. My desktop actually regularly takes a new image of its operating system drive in case something goes wrong. I can take an image of a system that I have deployed all my software to and then redeploy that image to multiple drives. That laptop, the Panasonic CF53, I upgraded a bunch of them to 500 gig SSDs like this one. And that was the procedure that I used, is I picked one, I upgraded it to the latest version of Windows, installed all my updates, made sure all my software that I wanted was on there, took my image, and then I just started redeploying that image to new drives. And at that point, I just had to boot the system and punch in the correct Windows serial key at that point. So we're going to image this disk. There's a couple of options in here, most of which you don't need for what we're doing today, but they may be of some value to certain people. Macrium has two different methods of copying data off the disk. There's the intelligent sector copy, which is what we're going to use here, and the most common one. It only copies things that have been used by the file system, certain system files that get disregarded when a system boots, like the page file, hibernation file, don't get copied when you do this. So if I have a system that I put to sleep with, say, 32 gigs of RAM, I could have a decent size hibernation file there that I don't really want to duplicate if I'm just upgrading it to an SSD. There's also the exact copy of the partitions, which includes unused sectors. And I've used this one before for data recovery. So I can take an image of this drive, which will copy every single sector as it is. And therefore, if there are files that have been deleted but not necessarily overwritten, I can run file recovery utilities from that without potentially risking damaging the existing drive. So we'll use the intelligent sector copy. There is a compression option on here that mostly plays with the time. The medium, which is the default, is usually fine. So here we've got system reserved, primary, that's the OS partition, little recovery partition, and, oh yeah, I should pick a location. We're just going to save it. We're just going to save it right in Documents. And this is where it asks for retention rules. So if you're creating a template that you want to use, or a image that you're going to regularly run, like I mentioned desktops earlier, this is where you would set up some of those rules. We're not going to do any of that. We're just going to hit finish. I don't want to save the backup file. I just want to run it right now. And so this is going to create a snapshot of the disk and then start to copy it to, in this case, the C drive of our test bench. Now, I could have done a direct clone. In this particular instance, I didn't, for a variety of reasons. I want to reuse that image. However, if I had a second USB device like this, or if I had taken this and plugged it into one of the SATA ports in my test bench, I could clone the drive instead. And that is a fairly popular one for laptop upgrades. So you get your laptop, you order your new drive, and, well, there's only one SATA bay in the laptop. So you get a USB device, plug your SSD in externally, clone everything over, and then throw your new drive in, reboot, and off you go. I didn't do that this time. Well, for one, like I said, I want to reuse this image later for a couple of things. Number two is that my experience cloning takes more time. And I could have done that with that laptop, and this process that it's taking me about 16 minutes, it says, to take the image, would likely have run over an hour. Which is fine if you don't have any other options, but we do. I'll be back in 15 minutes. Image completed in 20 minutes, 27 seconds. Neat. So now I have a drive image, which in this case is saved as an MRIMG file. There's a couple of different things I can do with that drive image. And we're going to do the most basic one, which is just restore it to a disk. So I've got the SSD in my dock now. I'm going to refresh it. Don't really care what's on it. There's my image file. Restore the image. Pick my disk. There it is. Now I need to delete the existing partition. And to start, I'm actually going to uncheck the box for partition 3, which is just a recovery partition. And then I'm going to copy over the first two. And the reason for that is, if you look, well, my new drive's bigger than my old one. And technically Macrium can do this in either direction, as long as your used space isn't more than your new drive. So I only used about 100 gigabytes on this for drive C. Technically I could restore this all to a 256 gig SSD, and even a 120 technically, but that'd be super tight and ridiculous. But anyway, so I'm going to go into the restored partition properties, and I'm going to take and make the free space available equal to 545 megabytes, and hit OK. And that's going to expand the operating system partition so that I don't have to go in and do it after the fact. And now I'm just going to drag the recovery partition over in the empty space that I left for it. And if I look, oh, there we go. Next, finish. And now it's, yes, all data will be overwritten. That's fine. Now it's going to restore everything and unfortunately pop them open here, because that's just what Windows does when it sees a new volume. Everything to the SSD. And this is that simple. All right. Oh, 7 minutes. I guessed under. Okay. Well, with that done, that's it. This drive, once I put it back in its little carrier, will boot in that CF53. No problem. And it's going to be in exactly the same state as the other drive. And I'm going to guess that we're going to cut our boot time in, I'm going to say half. The CF53 is pretty dated these days. So I'm going to say it'll take us in half, which originally we were at a minute and 36 seconds. We'll round up that 0.02 seconds. So slide this back in. Same filthy CF53. All right, so reset. Put this on this side, hoping it's more visible. There's our Windows startup sound, and hey, I can log in. Okay, so 27 seconds, we'll call it. That's huge, and that's part of why I tell everyone, get an SSD. Don't even bother with trying to boot off these antiques anymore. You're just going to make yourself upset. If you're building your first desktop, my advice is get the biggest SSD that you can, and then if you need more storage in a few months, buy a hard drive. It's like $50 for a couple of terabytes. You're going to be happier if you start with a 500 gig or a 1 terabyte SSD and then add that later instead of like getting a 250 and then buying a 4 terabyte hard drive. It's just messy. But that's not here nor there. We want to talk about Macrium. It was simple. I mean, I installed it. The software is free. And off it went. It took 30 minutes, 45 minutes total to upgrade this antique to, you know what? I want to do it again. So it took us 28 seconds. Powered all the way off. Oh. Here we go. I didn't think I had hit the power button. $15 seconds to hear it, 18 seconds that time. So, yeah, off it goes. And guys, this was just a standard SATA SSD. Not to pick on the MX500, it's a good drive, but it's basically kind of the end of the road evolution-wise for a performance SATA drive. It is a TLC Silicon Motion SATA SSD with a DRAM cache. I mean, there are newer, bigger drives, and there are some cheaper drives, but that was basically the formula at the end for, I want to make a fast SATA SSD. Unless you were Samsung and you used your controller, you basically went with a high-end Silicon Motion controller, you used a DRAM cache, and in Micron's case, they used IMFT flash, which is fantastic NAND, and that was it. You were done. You had built a high-performance SATA SSD, and yes, there's more engineering to it than that. I'm, talking about the recipe, not the actual mixing of the ingredients and the baking and the firmware. But anyway, that's the difference. I didn't optimize anything. I didn't change any of my software. I didn't change any settings. Guys, I haven't even signed into this to have done any of that. We're just looking at the boot screen, which I hope is coming through fairly well on camera. Well enough. It's kind of reflective. And I went from a minute, almost 2 minutes, to under 30 seconds. So anyway, back to the original topic. Cloning a drive is that simple. I took an image, and there's a couple of reasons for that. And then I want to talk about a couple of other features in Macrium before we close out. I said that direct cloning was possible. There are a couple of reasons I didn't do that. Number one, I want to play around with that image for a couple of other things, so I want it. Number two, it would have taken substantially longer to use this laptop to clone with the external drive. And the reason for that is Macrium can read from the operating system that it's running on and clone things over, but it has to keep track of a lot more stuff, and that takes a lot more time if it has to keep track of what temporary files might be changed, maybe Windows Update kicks off in the background on it. So overall, that's just a worse experience. It's entirely reasonable to achieve it if you're only going to do it once, but since I do this pretty regularly, I have one of these, and I've just gotten in the habit of taking an image because I have enough space to store one somewhere. But you don't have to do it that way. Now, the other option, and let's go back to our test bench, would be Macrium supports creating a boot disk. So under this other tasks, there's a create rescue media function. And what that allows you to do is create a flash drive that you can boot into a functional copy of Macrium and then either restore an image that you have stored on media that's not the operating system drive on the system, or I should say not the target drive, or clone. So I could have plugged this USB dock in, created my rescue media, which, by the way, reads the drivers that are on the system. So let's go ahead and we'll say removable USB device. Yeah, that's fine. So we're going to hit build. And this rescue media, you know, it'll load drivers for your USB controllers. Right now I can see that it found that I have a Wi-Fi card and it's adding support for that to its image. So if you create the media with the system that you're restoring to or cloning a drive on, well, it's going to have all your drivers, which is fantastic. Beyond that, there are other things you can do with Macrium. And I wish I hadn't actually decided to build the rescue medias, because I would show you some of those. In fact, you can see here there's this browse image section. That allows me to actually mount and explore. No, I don't want to format the USB. So we'll browse image, and we'll just open Drive F. So it allows me to mount and explore the image of this drive that I just took. And I can pull files out of it. I can inject files into it if I'm using it for deployment. I can do whatever I would with it. Okay, you used to be able to convert an MRIMG into a VHD file. There are still options to create bootable MRIMG files that way, although that was an optional component when I installed, and it may be that I need that component for that particular functionality. Since I don't have Hyper-V enabled on this particular system, well, I didn't install that component because I wasn't going to use it. But I probably will end up enabling Hyper-V at some point. All right, so guys, that's enough rambling, talking around in circles. I'm hoping that I can edit this down to something reasonable. If you skip to the end, basically the long and short of it is Macrium's great. It let me take an image and upgrade my system without doing any actual work on the system. And drive cloning is easy. It took me time, but I didn't have to dig around in the command line. I didn't have to do anything weird. I'm not going to say it's a perfect process. There are occasionally issues, especially if you're cloning or restoring an image from a spinning hard disk. In fact, I have a friend that just encountered one where he had to run check disk on his drive first because there was some file table corruption. So that's always a possibility. In fact, we could have encountered that today. I didn't know the state of that drive before I started. As always, I want to thank anyone who helps support Pocketables, either via Patreon or using our Amazon affiliate links, which there will be some to a couple of different SATA USB docks in the description below. Support like that helps make videos like this possible. I want to thank Electrix for providing our opening and closing themes. And finally, thank you for watching.